and I can't tell you how happy I am to introduce Dr. Lambert. And Dr. Lambert, over the last couple of years, maybe more, I think it's been around 2 years, has become a very close colleague and friend of mine. And I appreciate so greatly his insight and how he really pushes our team in so many important ways. And I think today is going to be another example of that. So Dr. Lambert is a faculty member in the Department of Indigenous Studies and is from, I can never pronounce this right. So Simon, you'll have to do this for me, please.
I can do that. My tribes,
yeah.
Tuhoi and Ngāti Ruapani, a place called Waikaremoana.
Thank you. And his doctoral research was on a small scale Maori horticulture, and he was awarded his PhD in 2008 from Lincoln University. Prior to that, he was awarded an MA of honors degree from the University of Canterbury after researching the assessment of environmental vulnerability in the Pacific. Following the 2010-11 earthquakes in Christchurch, Dr. Lambert's research was focused on disaster risk reduction for Indigenous communities with particular interest in urban Indigenous groups. He has taught a variety of courses in Indigenous planning and development and will be teaching Aboriginal development in the fall semester, and a special topic on international Indigenous disaster risk reduction in I guess taught that in 2018. Yeah. So again, I want to add one more thing is that our team, which is made up of a substantial number of people, were just awarded the National Coordinating Center for all of the new Indigenous research centers that have been created across the country. And Simon very graciously has agreed to be our scientific director for the National Coordinating Center, which makes me incredibly happy. And in that role as scientific director, Simon will be pulling together national and international research grants in Indigenous health and supporting the Indigenous centers across the country, 2 of whom are one's in Yellowknife and one is in Nunavut. So we have 2 northern centers, but supporting them to pull together national grants and international grants. So I just encourage any of you who are on this talk today that if you're interested in being part of that, to contact Simon or myself or one of our team members. And so with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Lambert. Thank you.
Kia ora, Caroline. Thank you very much. Lovely introduction. It's not the first webinar I've given. I'll probably never get used to them, but the new normal, as we all know. So I was asked to come along and talk about, basically build off some of my past research and try and get some sort of a way to understand and frame what we're going through at the moment. And I mean, I'll take questions at the end, but I think there'll be better experts on the precise details of the medical components to a pandemic than me, and certainly the context here, but let's give it a go. Anyway, so I'll talk a little bit about who I am and what I know about disasters. Working in the Indigenous space, primarily my research has been with Indigenous communities, and as Caroline mentioned, I have a particular interest in urban communities, where most of us live. 85% of Māori are urban from my father's generation on. And then I'll talk a couple of definitions and terms that we use in disaster research, then a little bit of history, and then trying to get a handle on what's going on in Saskatchewan, talk a little bit about research challenges and working in disaster contexts, and then I'll take questions at the end, but I'd imagine it'd be as much a conversation as anything else. The picture there is Ruomoko, who is the unborn child of Papatuanuku, the Earth Mother. And for Māori, the mythical cause of earthquakes and volcanic activity is Ruomoko dancing, kanikani, dancing in his mother's belly. So when we talk of environmental hazards in the Indigenous space, these hazards are relations. All right, they're whānau, they're family, and they're always going to be family. We're always going to have the hazards, but how we respond, how we plan and develop around these hazards is what actually builds in resilience for our communities. So who am I? My mountain is called Panikiri, and that's her top mid-screen there. And our lake is Waikaremoana. There's a river that flows out, again, the top of the picture, called Waikaretaiheke. And my tribes, as I mentioned earlier, Tūhoe and Ngāti Ruapani. And the marae, the community spaces, are called AOTEAROA and Waimako. And my whānau, my family, is the Lambert whānau. And when it comes to identity and engagement as Māori and in community, it's family-based. And I think that is for most Indigenous peoples. And so I've always identified primarily as a Lambert, which is an English name, and our ancestor came from Kent in England. Another story. The environmental context that I grew up with, I mean, we always felt earthquakes. I've never seen a tsunami. There was a tsunami warning when I was in Hawke's Bay as a teenager, and you know what the locals did? The local surfers all strapped their surfboards onto their station wagons and their V-dubs, and they drove to the beach. All right. The picture on the left there is a mountain called Tarawera, which erupted in 1886, killed over 100 people, most of them Māori. So it's an environment, anywhere you've got mountains, British Columbia, anywhere you've got hot springs, volcanoes, you're going to have this sort of activity, ruamoko, dancing in the belly of his mother. On the right there, part of the preparedness that the New Zealand authorities put in place for this sort of activity was in Wellington, the picture there, a series of blue painted lines on the roads to indicate where they had modelled the upper reach of a tsunami. And the top picture there, I mean, it is at least 20 meters above sea level. It could be 25, a little bit more. So the destructive power we're seeing from the Boxing Day tsunami, the Fukushima, well, the Great Eastern, the Tohoku earthquake in Japan, and subsequent disaster with the power station there. To be honest, no tsunami is going to look at 4 inches of blue paint and go, you know, better stop here. A little bit like the 2-meter warning. I mean, surely there's the occasional virus goes, I'm just going to push it a little bit further. But, you know, I have sympathy for the authorities. They've got to come up with plans, with strategies, and my intent is that we keep the conversation going, we build our understanding up as Indigenous researchers and for our communities, and we actually get our voices involved in these debates. So what do I know about disasters? Most of it has come from experiences and research projects following the Christchurch earthquake, February 22nd, 2011. The picture there was taken just a few seconds after the event, which was lunchtime. It was a weekday. 185 deaths, 181 of them on the day, 4 of them subsequently from injuries. And so it's a horrific picture to me and to people who went through that event. I actually wasn't there at the time. I was in the North Island, and that creates another sort of anxiety, which I know people will be feeling now. Those who are separated from their family, we can't fly back to New Zealand at the moment. There'll be people in Saskatchewan, there'll be people listening in here who can't be with their elderly parents, with their community maybe, or maybe their children are studying elsewhere. There's an ongoing anxiety, and at the moment we don't have an endpoint for that. Just summarising the research that we did, there were 3 projects I was on. Essentially, we found that our cultural practices, our institutions like the marae, provided pretty important resources in the response to our community and to other communities. It is not as though Indigenous people only look after Indigenous people in a disaster. Our cultural practices, our values require us to support other people. There's a lot of irony in that when we talk about relationships with treaty partners and so on. But that's what we observed, that's what we recorded and analysed, and that's what I continue to see around the world. The local tribe, who are called Ngaitahu, in the response or in the recovery period, they were a keystone investor in the rebuild. And they provided a strategic document. They were the first organisation to provide a strategic document setting out their vision for the recovery period. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on. I also did a project where, very small survey, I found that those who had self-reported increases or stable well-being 13 months after the event, they were actually going into that event with considerable economic security. And not everybody I presented these results to were happy about that. And it was about our culture was positioned and explained and described and put on a pedestal as fundamental, as necessary and sufficient to our resilience. And like I say, small project, and I'm not going to play it up too much, but it's really stating the obvious. If you go into a disaster in an economically vulnerable position, you ain't coming out of it in a particularly strong position. But also there are other hazards. There are things going on, climate change and sea level rise, that are still requiring us to have some sort of preparation for. This is a saying that came out of research from a major earthquake in Chile in 1970. Really important work done by an American anthropologist, Tony Oliver Smith. And this is one of the comments that came out of his research. First the earthquake, then the disaster. What he was examining was a highly corrupt society trying to respond and recover to a massive disaster. And so for people he was meeting and for the conversations that were going on, is that the corrupt context in which authorities and communities were trying to respond was the true disaster. And that, I think, gives us some insight into how we're going to come out of the pandemic. The economic crisis, it's here. The economic crunch that is here is perhaps certainly going to exacerbate any vulnerabilities that individuals, households and communities are experiencing now. And we use this word disaster a lot, and we see it in headlines now. You can open your phone and you can get pictures and videos of disasters as they unfold, which can be pretty horrific and can be very traumatizing. So there's some pictures, clockwise, left to right. That's the Quebec Bridge disaster in 1907, I think. 77 men were killed in that, 33 of them from the local Kahanawagi community. And Mohawk iron workers are renowned. They built World Trade Center. They built the building that replaced the World Trade Center. And their experience of these sorts of disasters, tragedies, but it's never put them off ironwork. Right? We don't run from opportunity. It's the lesson I take from that. Fort McMurray fire, First Nations and Métis communities hosted evacuees from that, and still one of the more remarkable evacuations you will ever see from a significant event like that. Boxing Day tsunami, there were stories of Indigenous knowledge coming out of that, where 3 or 4 generations ago there was a significant tsunami, and stories passed on in the form of songs that would be sung to children. And so one of the stories, when you see the water buffalo running inland, follow them. Right? It's simple stuff. Let's not overanalyze it. But the transmission of that knowledge is really important. And a lot of locals lost their lives in that, even though they may have had this knowledge, for the simple reason that they were located in coastal areas for employment, education, and health. And then I've already touched on Fukushima. So that picture there was from a local Japanese television station. And it's still leaking radioactivity into the Pacific Ocean. And it will do for thousands of years. So these are the sort of things that we easily associate as disasters. But it's still something that has to be defined, and who defines them, who defines when an event is a disaster and where they occur and what we should do and what can we do to reduce future risks if we do anything at all. What are the physical parameters? And in earthquake research, you will see a lot of work done by geophysicists, geological engineers, you know, building specialists, and it's fundamental. I have no problem with that. But to me, a disaster is not a natural disaster. You have a natural hazard, but in the social sciences, we've been pushing for a long time that disasters are social. How you design buildings, where you locate them, the sort of people you train for what events, the resourcing, all these things, when and where they are lacking, that's what creates a disaster. So it's actually a socially constructed event. A beautiful interface of society and culture and politics and economics engaging with the planet. So what are the social and cultural parameters? When is a disaster over? I mean, is this pandemic over when we can flood back out into the streets? I mean, it's going to vary across society. And for Indigenous people, we have different background, different interpretation, different worldview of everything, including disasters. So just some stamps I've put up there. You gotta love society. It will put on a stamp. I mean, anyone under the age of 30 is probably not going to know what a stamp is, right? But put on a stamp. This is elevating and expressing something important about that society. Captain James Cook, we have in common around the Commonwealth and the British Empire. And these are moments of arrival. These are individuals who led missions and expeditions to our lands and to our territories. And for Indigenous peoples, Columbus Day for our friends and neighbors to the south and around Central America, right? These things are labels for Indigenous disasters. Here's the Canadian definition from Public Safety Canada documents a couple of years ago. Simple stuff, nothing really controversial there. I'd point attention to this idea that an event doesn't necessarily have to kill anybody, doesn't necessarily have injured or infected or evacuated people. It's something of historical significance, something, you know, that resonates for society, for a community as being disastrous. Right? And anything that a community can't recover from on its own. And it wasn't that long ago that First Nations to the north here were declaring these waves of these clusters of suicides as states of emergency that their communities could not recover from on their own. And also a list of sort of hazards that Canada has listed as requiring some sort of strategy. So again, interesting one there, astronomical. Asteroids, comets, and meteor crashes. There's actually a web page out there. I don't advise you find it in the current state of anxiety, but you can plug in your location and choose the size of a NEO, near Earth object, and have it plummet into an area near you, and you can see the area of impact. So, you know, if a big one hit Minot, just a city or a town I'd never heard of till coming here, you wouldn't want to be in downtown Regina that day, right? So anxiety inducing, but there we have the list of disease or a topology for the types of diseases that we're concerned about, on and on. And right at the end there, terrorism is now considered a hazard by many states around the world. This is a post 9/11 phenomenon, and they have considerable legislative structures around that. And I can guarantee that ministers of defence around the world kept up at night by a number of things, and one of them would be terrorist attack during this pandemic. And we use the word risk a lot. Risk, we have a risk of this and a risk of that. So in simple terms, it's your exposure to a hazard. Not a lot of exposure to seismic activity here in Saskatchewan, but there is in BC. There is in none of it. There is over in the Atlantic coast. A researcher a few years ago put out this idea that actually it's the concept of outrage that draws attention to risk. And here's a picture of now ingesting hot
Oh,
smoke
shit, I don't know what's
or
going. I can hear
that's,
him, but I don't know why I'm getting these things on my
I can hear
phone.
you. Technology. Look, and there's a picture of poor Mr. Phelps who ingesting hot substances into his massive lungs. People were outraged. It's outrageous that an Olympic champion should put his, role model out there in this particular way. And that. So I'm always interested in what events and what disasters, what emergencies get attention. There's quite a bit of research goes into this, and of course, long story short, Indigenous issues are often sidelined, marginalised, or completely ignored. Data coming out of the United States at the moment showing that African American communities and Hispanic communities are experiencing greater mortality from COVID-19. No surprises, generally poorer, generally more crowded housing conditions, but no data yet from the US on Indigenous peoples. The stats I've seen from the US, Indigenous communities always suffer more than African American communities and Hispanic communities in events like this. So touching base again on Captain James Cook, in 1779, a year after the event that this stamp is commemorating, our Hawaiian whanaunga, our Hawaiian cousins, were outraged at Captain Cook, and February the 14th killed him. So outrage is something that each community, each culture frames in different ways. And we use the word vulnerability a lot. Our communities are vulnerable to pandemics and vulnerable to economic crises and all this. A lecturer of mine, Dr. Heidi Elmore, Australian geographer, published a paper in 2005 from research that she did with Aboriginal communities in Australia, pointing out again the obvious, but it does need to be stated, it needs to be put into the literature, that when we talk about vulnerability with our communities, right, it's like an onion, right? There's layers to this. So if you do not take into consideration the context of colonization, you're not really getting to grips with what vulnerability is for our communities. And she also points out that when emergency managers turn up to an event, to a crisis, it's a hierarchy. It's command and control. It's often militarized, and it's often the military. We're starting to see that around the world. And different societies will call in the military earlier than others. So in New Zealand, the military's involved, but they're not frontline at this stage. So we're vulnerable. I mean, one of the things I'm forever thankful for coming out of geography is there's been some really important work done by Indigenous geographers and supported ably by non-Indigenous allies. And one in particular, Professor John Campbell, who was a Pākehā, white geographer at the University of Waikato, who did research in the Pacific and was saying, actually, you know what, here everyone is calling Pacific Island communities vulnerable. They have been in the Pacific dealing with tsunami, with cyclones, with drought for 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years. If this is vulnerability, give it to me. So he actually started to push in geography a very early, mid-90s, resilience discourse. So I've been aware of the concept of resilience for some time. So a couple of complex diagrams or stuff I think is important. So 4 terms, again, we use constantly. The 4R model comes out of New Zealand Civil Defence. After the event, after the earthquake, February 22nd, we're in response mode. All right, every second can count. You seeg into recovery after some time. Again, no clear boundaries. Some people start recovering earlier. Some communities recover earlier than others, depending on all sorts of things. And it doesn't matter how much you want to go back before the event and fill your emergency kit up with, put the chocolate back that you've eaten, put fresh batteries in and water and all that. It's too late. You're responding. Hopefully you get through to recovery. So the 2 phases before the event are fundamental to how you're going to come out of it. The reduction in your exposure and the readiness for the event. We know that we're going to have earthquakes around the Pacific. We know that we're going to have drought in places like the prairies. We know we're going to have pandemics, all right? But if you haven't put in place your reduction and readiness strategies, you are just swamped and you're struggling, and things are going to be a lot worse. So when we talk of resilience, is there a way, or is it an example of shortening that recovery period? So we get back, we get our jobs back, you know, we're resilient and we get our jobs back end of April. That would be awesome. All right, so shortening that period to recover, to get back to some sort of normality. And there's also the idea that a resilient individual, household, society has less impacts. They're not as negatively impacted as the next town, the next household or something. Again, mitigating your exposure and the risks that you're subject to. So we use the word resilience a lot. I think we overuse it. It's become a little bit like the concept of sustainability. When British Petroleum put out their sustainability press release, that's when and that was years ago. That was over a decade ago. That's when I knew that's when I knew we were in trouble. Likewise, we're very quick to claim resilience is a characteristic, and I think there's risks to that. All right. So what are we talking about when we talk about resilience? How do we measure it? How do we evaluate it? And does it trap us in this sort of constantly saying, no, we're fine, we're resilient, everything's okay, we're handling this, we're dealing with. And the risk we saw with the earthquakes in New Zealand was after 2 or 3 years of seismic activity, there was an earthquake 2 days ago there, which really brought a lot of issues back, I'm sure. It traps people into a stance of not asking for help. And we saw with men in particular, 2 years down the track, they were literally falling over. So I'm always very wary about using this concept of resilience willy-nilly. But an interesting quote from some research relevant to here from Kermeyer et al. 2012. And this lovely pink-coloured book there. Hold up the camera. Oh, it's backwards. Indigenous concepts of resilience are grounded in cultural values that have persisted despite profound changes in the nature of community life. I like that. Hang on to that. And this is something from a friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Victor Okri, a Nigerian scholar. Every disaster is a storyteller. And as storytelling people, we tell stories about these disasters. Hawaiians tell stories about Captain Cook. Māori tell stories about the Christchurch earthquakes, and people will be telling stories about COVID-19. I found some interesting graphics on past pandemics. Nicholas Lepin, I've got the reference down in the link in the bottom corner there. I find we do need visuals to get across some complex ideas. So here's a timeline of various pandemics. You'll recognize some of these. The Black Death, bubonic plague from the mid-1300s there in purple. Smallpox event in 1520. That's Indigenous centric. Plagues continuing, cholera, third plague. I hadn't even heard of half of these, to be honest. HIV/AIDS there in the foreground. COVID right down there in the bottom, and I'm not diminishing the impacts of COVID, and it is not over yet. I might be the first to acknowledge that. But it does, again, beg the question for those societies that weren't prepared for this and had full knowledge of this history and the expectation of future events. You know, we're scrambling around for masks, run out of hand sanitizer, run out of toilet paper. You know, it's really, I mean, we can sort of laugh about it a little bit, but it's a surprise to only people who don't know their history, and a surprise to governments who don't do their jobs. And again, putting it in context in a different way, Black Death and COVID right down the bottom there, and HIV/AIDS there, it's still with a lot of our communities. hasn't gone away. And again, are we more vulnerable now to the return of certain events? The Americas, of course, have a horrific history. Our friends way to the south there, massive population decline, right? Just there in a single graph. But I did find, and thanks to Dr. Stuart Skinner, who sent around a literature review that he was a part of from 2016, using H1N1, has given us some sort of insight to future pandemics, and the future pandemic is here. So 2 waves, and there'll be people on the line now at the moment who know a lot more about this than me. So I've just gone through that publication and pulled out some relevant stuff. Inuit overrepresented in the first wave. They acknowledge that there's not a lot of research on Inuit, likewise Métis. First Nations overrepresented in the second wave. Métis consistently underrepresented. But again, most of the research is on First Nations. Geographic isolation. Again, no surprises. I know there are communities there putting up physical barriers and trying to regulate people coming and going. My fear is that once it's in, it has a really, really severe effect. Differences across provinces. The literature review pointed out that Manitoba First Nations often had the youngest and poorest reserve populations, and this seemed to make them more vulnerable. And none of it most severely impacted in some respects. And again, I don't think there are any cases, none of it yet. It's changing daily, of course. Alberta having a lot of just going to move their hospital admissions. Quebec reporting the most, Ontario the most deaths, different levels of preparedness. And again, it's to be expected, but it does give us a heads up for what might be coming. And this I found pretty frightening. 16% of hospitalized cases were Indigenous women, 18% of ICU cases, 50% of fatalities for those reporting ethnicity, which was probably almost definitely underreported. Gaps in knowledge all the way through. It's what the literature review was pointing out. General consensus that Indigenous communities are especially vulnerable to severe manifestations of H1N1. What's going on in Saskatchewan? This was from, I found it this morning, but I think the date is from yesterday, April 8th. I mean, I guess Saskatoon is sticking out there, but where Saskatoon's boundaries are drawn for this map, it's fairly big. Not many noted to the north. I know there's not a lot of tests being done at the moment. And again, interested to see if anyone has any insight and updates on this. I'll just leave that up there for a little bit longer. Only 3 deaths, which is, you know, every death is one too many because it's all preventable. But I actually was expecting it to be a lot worse by now. There's been 1 death in New Zealand, but as an island nation, a little bit easier to pull up the drawbridge. And I have some friends on Facebook who work for PAGC, Prince Albert Grand Council, as most of you will know. So regular updates coming through, and latest one I found there from Chief Isaiah Charles. So looking to resource people who are wanting to get up onto their trap lines. So there are families and communities here who have pretty good options if you want to go into isolation for a period of time. Looking out there, the snow is melting. Southern Hemisphere, of course, is going into winter, which is their flu season. Okay, so things could have been a lot worse here if we were going into winter, I think. Oh, and the note there from NEFA, the Northern Intertribal Health Authority, which some of you be familiar with, noting just the lack of masks and gowns and so on. They put a request in, but this is a scramble, or this is a global issue. And I think some of the stuff in the news media about the US tools and mechanisms and machinations around doing the best for their people, I accept and admit that. But I think coming out of this in the next year or two, every society, every economy and every government is going to be looking at how to build resilience and capacity into their health systems. So again, I think Indigenous voices should be informing that for those regions where we are. Some, well, a publication I put out there, not a lot of research, it was really drawing attention to the Res Cross, which was an Indigenous venture to provide support for evacuees from the 2015 fires. There were formal centres set up by the Red Cross. There were issues around, and PAGC representatives are very polite and very diplomatic about this, so I'll take it on my head. There were instances of racism from frontline responders and staff associated with groups such as the Red Cross, and that led to concerns about a lack of cultural safety, and First Nations stepped up, filled that gap. And so the Res Cross is the sort of thing that we should expect and we should support, and they have now come to a formal agreement and a historic agreement between PAGC and Saskatchewan Red Cross. I think Saskatchewan and Manitoba Red Cross are a combined unit to collaborate on future evacuations. All right, so that's awesome. To sum up all that experience, Indigenous communities here know their environment, physical environment, social environment. The knowledge can reduce the risk of disasters, but the knowledge, as most of us would know and are annoyed by, is too often ignored. Communities are also and always recovering from the long-term impacts of colonization. That's a given. Despite all that racism, I do see individuals here and around the world and their communities stepping up and playing fundamental roles in managing this emergency and others. So here is one of the outcomes of my research. Is what we found is that those 4 phases I talked about, response, recovery, hopefully prior to that, reduction and readiness, we are overlapping in all those areas. So I was talking to interview subjects who were responding and recovering from other disasters, from economic crises, so the financial crisis 2008, who had lost a child, who had lost a partner. All right, so on the one hand, yep, we're all going to try and get through this pandemic, but there are other people who have, again, like layers of history and trauma that they're just trying to respond and recover to. And so, I mean, anyone out there worried about sea level rise and climate change at the moment? No, we're just trying to get some chocolate for the kids for the weekend, all right? There's not a lot of space for our leaders and our voices, our researchers, to actually get ahead of the curve, to put in place strategies of reduction and readiness, because we're constantly swamped by crises, emergencies, and we're having to respond and recover from those. But here's, let's have an upside. So the local tribe in Christchurch, Ngaitahu, were the first organisation to put out a strategic vision for the recovery. And the reason they were the first is because they have internal coherency. They have a values-based framework. And so their strategy came from that. Every other organisation in the private sector, the city council and regional council, had competing values. You've got you've got the left wing and the Green Party, you've got the centrists, and you've got the right wing and the far right, and you've got business interests, and you've got faith-based organisations. You have a cacophony. There's a word I haven't used for a while. A cacophony of voices competing for attention, and in the end, their processes will lead to a vote generally. Indigenous processes are generally around a consensus. So they put out the strategic government. It wasn't all taken up, but they filled a void. All right. There, and I'm seeing now at the moment, there is a void of thinking at the highest levels of governance in the province, the country, across Turtle Island, across the world. That people are scrambling around. I mean, what's the future of fossil fuels? There's an impact here. All right, what's the future of solar energy? There's all these competing voices. I think it's an opportunity for Indigenous groups to roll out the manifesto. What do you want the future to look like? Because there's a gap, and at the moment, this is the time when you're going to have opportunity to get traction for your ideas. But also talking about research challenges. I'm a researcher. I love it. I can't imagine doing anything else. And how are we going to operate in this climate? So there's been people thinking about this from earlier events. And the quote there from a publication, what's different about disaster research? Well, actually, not much in some respects. I use the tools that anyone is open to use in a normal time. But it's the circumstances in which we're deploying these methods, right? It's different. Back in the Christchurch earthquake days, you had to be careful negotiating the streets and footpaths, and you had to be alert to heavy objects in the room. All right. Here we can't actually have face-to-face contact. Got to be alert to all those sort of risks. We're actually deploying our methods in constrained circumstances. We lack the normal time we would have to develop research instruments. And there's a wider context of confusion, anxiety, and what do we prioritize? What gets the attention? Like I say, climate change and all that, I think it's really important. It's not going away. But conferences on that have been, like all conferences, been cancelled and committees disbanded, and they're switching onto this. And working as an isolated individual, I mean, essentially I'm in a room talking to myself. I know you're all out there, but this is not normal, all right? And so there's something fundamental we're missing out on. And I've said to a lot of people, this is a marathon, not a sprint. So there's all kind of, I've got my jokey Zoom background, but it ain't going to be funny in a couple of months. Right? What I would argue is that, unfortunately, all the research on and around involving, collaborating with Indigenous peoples takes place in a context of response and recovery. There's trauma. People get exhausted. You'll find when you do interviews, it's often the same people who volunteer. They're the people who turn up to a church hall on a Tuesday night in the middle of winter. They're there in a cake stall on a Sunday afternoon. All right, people get tired. There's frustration. Things just don't seem to get better. They certainly don't get better quick enough. And we do still rely on colonial structures, the money, how we're evaluated often, although we're trying to change that. But I would emphasize that we've got the advantage of knowing this, of recognizing and having the foresight to try and develop the necessary skills, whether it's with our young researchers coming through, with our allies. All right, we can recognize what's needed and recognize the character, the type of person that can flourish and support our communities this time. And what? And I use "and what" now in a lot of the end of a lot of presentations. It comes from our son Bruno. When I tell him to do something, he goes, "And what?" 6'2" now. Not a lot follows from that. What is the story of this disaster? Can it end happily ever after? All right, who's going to be the storytellers on this? Well, we're going to be some of the storytellers. I think part of our job as researchers is to bring attention to Indigenous voices and the experiences of Indigenous communities. We've got to get some traction out there in policy, and we've got to start moving ahead and getting some sort of disaster risk reduction strategy out there, because when this happens again, right, we know it's going to happen again, and some of us will be alive when the next pandemic comes. We're not scrambling around for hand sanitizer, I almost swore then, hand sanitizer, toilet paper and all this. We have some sort of strategy, we have some capacity to handle it better. Kia ora koutou, ka nui te mihi ki a koutou, kua tai mai ki te whakarongorongo mai ki taku kōrero. That's a picture I took it's a church that fell down in the Christchurch earthquakes. A lot of churches fell down, taking away a sacred space for a lot of people, including our people. I know we can blame the missionaries, but A lot of our people are faith-based in their lives. And yes, there's a significant grammatical error in the graffiti. I should put that out there for students, and 10% could spot it. But that's the end of that. And like I say, I'm happy to take questions, but there's people out there who know more about what's going on than me.
Thanks, Simon. I'm just going to unmute everybody, and then there are lots of people on the call. So if you don't have a question, just please mute yourself again, but we'll open it up to everybody who's attending. Thanks so much.
My pleasure.
So Simon, I guess I have a question. I can start. This is Caroline here. One of the things, so I had a conversation this morning with a very good friend of mine in Montreal who's headed over right now to look at my son's apartment because my son had to leave relatively quickly. And he was telling me a story as he's starting a restaurant in Montreal that basically the police were called yesterday because there were two people, him and another person, working in the restaurant trying to get it up and running. And he was talking about the amount of surveillance that is now occurring in Montreal, where neighbors are calling the police on neighbors, and things like that are happening. And I raise that because of the length of this pandemic and this disaster, and that in other, like, so for instance, with the earthquakes, the risk was different in the sense that there's an episode and then there's aftershocks. And so collectively people are living similar to now with the idea that the risk is everywhere and that it's not really clear who's going to be impacted. Although here, hearing on the news today and the numbers that definitely, we know that people that are with existing pre-health conditions and that are at greater risk. And, but risk is over this long period of time that, social distancing and that. And so we have, like, now it looks like in Montreal and maybe other places where people are reporting on one another, and this level of surveillance that people are not social distancing or not acting in what are appropriate ways. But we also have technology, right? So then in other countries where they're tracking us by our phones and determining whether we're staying at home or not. And so I guess my question is do you feel there's any risk in all of this, to particularly, and I work with, different organizations, Elizabeth Fry, and I work with Straight Up, and, organizations of some of our most vulnerable people who are not in situations where it's all that easy maybe to self-isolate, and not all that easy to be out of the eye of the public in ways that a lot of us are capable of doing, right? And so what is your take on stigma, surveillance, risk, and resilience? Like, how does that all package together in a context like this, where we could be doing this for several months? And I know with some of our people that are dealing with addictions and are dealing with, that have no incomes or don't even fall into probably getting some of the supports that are being offered, or being in a context where they can apply for the money, or, like, that whole context worries me a great deal, that there could be increased surveillance over these individuals particularly that could have a long-term negative outcome for them in ways that are anticipated.
The surveillance thing is fascinating, isn't it? Because in a disaster, people will sacrifice, often willingly, their civil rights, their democratic rights, their privacy, because there's a sense of, like, well, we better do this. It's interesting though, you mentioned the snitches. I'm sure there's going to be differences across cultures and countries on this, because there's stories coming out of New Zealand as well, dobbing in people, this sort of like holier than thou attitude. It really annoys me, and I say that because the very first research I did was I was an undergrad. It's just a practice thing, but the perceptions of danger that people near prisons hold. And I interviewed, among others, the chief executive of New Zealand Prisons and Canterbury Prisons. And he said, we don't make low or medium security prisons escape-proof. That if a prisoner is having some sort of anxiety and frustration and anger that can only be resolved by getting over the walls for a day or two, they let them go. They don't make them escape-proof. And this changed my attitude on a lot of things, and how we often get it wrong, and how we don't necessarily know what the experts know and why they do what they do. So the idea of surveillance, governments around the world will be using this as an opportunity to shunt stuff through that they know that people don't like. Case in point, pipelines. All right, stuff is going to move ahead because people are distracted. People physically can't get to certain places to do certain things. You can suspend the rule of law. So one of the original, and it's from German legal scholarship, the sovereign was he who could declare an emergency, he who could declare a disaster and suspend normal operation of government. That was the sovereign. That was the power that a sovereign has. So surveillance, yes, there will be a huge growth in technological surveillance. And again, people may give up to that because they want this fixed and they get annoyed when people break the rules. There was significant surveillance on Indigenous evacuees from the Manitoba floods in 2011. People were out for years. They ended up in hotels and motels, and they were surveilled. Security guards were brought in to watch them because they were considered dangerous. So I think for our communities, our people, this is a high-risk time, and we've only just started, perhaps. I think we really need to be very careful about what policies are enacted. So last week, Saskatchewan extended the number of hours that a truck driver can drive emergency supplies, and the current, well, it used to be 13 hours, which I think is a hell of a lot to have to be able to drive, self-reported, to longer. Now, again, emergency supplies get the masks through. We got guys driving trucks 15, 16, 17 hours with a sense of urgency because they want to save lives. These are all the sorts of things, and I'm not aware of any discussion or debate going on about that because we're in a response phase. So I have, I don't want to be a doom and doom merchant. Our people are tough, but this is bad. And I don't see the end at this stage. Sorry. I'd love to be wrong on that.
Yeah, the thing about truck drivers that you said, that, like, I was a driver instructor in Saskatchewan, and to me, like, there's so many drivers right now that, like, stuff's moving slow. There's lots of drivers that can fill those positions and move trucks. Like, it makes zero sense to go over 13 in Saskatchewan, especially because it's within the borders. To me, it's silly.
And there's just not, decisions are being made very, very quickly. It could be 3 guys in a room. And because of the emergency situation, some people will applaud that. But like you say, if there was a system that went, geez, okay, there won't be as much truck traffic, so we'll have a lot of unemployed truck drivers. Let's get 2 to a cab. Let's get relay systems. It shouldn't be rocket science, but I'm sure there's reasons why that may not be, I don't know. But no debate, no discussion, and it's on to the next crisis,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, for sure. To be fair on that one, it's probably is a short-term thing. The more I think about it, like for like the emergency whatever companies, they have to get stuff done. So yeah, maybe.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, interesting list of people down here. I can see all your names, you know.
Simon, I'm just thinking, Simon and Alan commenting on that. Some things, though, you think are going to be an emergency, short-term thing, and then they stay with us. I'm thinking, like food banks were set up in 1980 as an emergency, short-term thing, and now like they're part of like the social safety net as it is.
Yeah, yeah.
You're still muted there, Simon.
Thanks. I'm getting the hang of it. The surveillance concept, people may now accept and have to accept, if you want to travel internationally, that you have some sort of invasive, whether it's, you know, at the moment you can be searched for all sorts of things at the border anyway. So your temperature's going to be taken, your previous movements, all this is recorded in most systems anyway. And essentially there will be an invasion of your civil rights. People and post 9/11, it's a different, people accept that because it was so horrific. And I think at this stage, facial recognition technology will become much more acceptable to a lot of people, because then it's like, oh, but if you're not doing anything wrong, why are you worried? What's the matter, Simon? Why are you concerned about this? With our young people and the idea of wearing a homemade mask. All right, so you're going to have an Indigenous kid with a homemade scarf, you know, maybe red with a skull and crossbones on it, because we got a sense of humor, walking downtown late at night. I mean, that would be best practice, or as good as perhaps as he or she could do. But that, you know, we all know that that's putting them into another risk situation. This sort of story is coming out of New Zealand as well. We don't call the police often back home because some of them are armed now. New Zealand police weren't armed up until the mosque shooting of last year. So that changed how people perceive the police in New Zealand. That they don't have guns. Now they have them in the boot, but you know, you want them on the hip there so you can pull it out and shoot the next terrorist. So people change the parameters of what's acceptable in society are changed by a disaster. Sometimes for better, improved building codes, and sometimes possibly for worse, increased surveillance, intrusion in people's lives and so on.
I have another question if no one else is going to ask a question. Is that okay?
I have a question, but you
see,
can.
Elder Louise Half is on the line. She's either on the line or someone's hacked her phone. I'd love to have some insight from an elder on this.
Eric, I think you had a question. Go ahead.
I do. Yeah, thank you. Hi, Dr. Lambert. I'm Eric from. I'm a medical student at Schulich School of Medicine in Ontario. And one thing that I've been sort of thinking about over the last week or so is just interdisciplinary approaches to pandemics and that sort of thing. And you alluded a lot to these sort of things in your discussion, your presentation. What I'm curious about is what those relationships look like, and you know, how one might go about establishing them in the context of doing research that could potentially do something like establish protocols or guidelines and that sort of thing. Yeah, if you could speak to that.
So some sort of principles and approaches for interdisciplinary work. You cut out a little bit at the start there.
Yeah, yes, to enter like to multidisciplinary approaches, because I really it struck me how you spoke about
personality and ego was a part of it as well. People defaulted to their discipline. They defaulted to the ways that they had been evaluated in the past, and the journals they wanted to publish in, and the conferences they were attending. That actually there was a lot of rhetoric about interdisciplinary cooperation, and at the end of the day, it was too hard for a lot of people. Professor Marie Baptiste put out and has put out with others the concept of trans-systemic knowledge, that our knowledge, or the knowledges held by Indigenous communities, sit above geography, human geography, cultural geography, all these geographies. You go to a community, and you go to any community, go to a white community and start talking about your subdisciplinary interests and the blah, blah, blah. People will just go, but aren't you at the University of Saskatchewan? We told the last person to come from the university this. Why don't you? How come he didn't tell you? What's the matter? How come you guys, why aren't you guys talking? You have people down the hallway who have no idea what their colleagues' precise approach is. So as we have to take on that challenge, that actually a lot of what we do and how we do it doesn't necessarily resonate with the taxpayer, the community, all these groups that we are beholden to. As far as principles and approaches, look, I'm a big fan of, we have instincts, our communities have instincts. So when we insist on face-to-face meetings, I think what happens is people appraise you. They're looking at you, they're eyeballing you, seeing how you engage and your manners and how you're dressed and how you behave, and just going on a character, like, oh yeah, that person, like, he's a bit of an idiot, but seemed okay, compared to some people who just great communities. And they can be Indigenous researchers as well, can go to a community and people are like, so there's just a process of being present, showing your face, engaging, being with the community. Linda Smith put out some principles from her thesis from 1990s. This would have been things like ka nohi kitea, the face that is seen. So if they don't see your face, like, why would they work with you? Which is a challenge at the moment. Because if you show your face now, you're putting people at risk. Don't flaunt your knowledge. Nobody likes a smart ass, and again, we're in a context where to be the smart ass is the thing, respect for people, host people, reciprocity, all these basic cultural norms, which you find across the Indigenous world. They're not special to Māori, they're across our world. Still work. They still work. Does it facilitate interdisciplinary stuff? I think we have to be very careful and mindful that our massive debates and differences in-house are so often meaningless off the campus. And this is as good a time as any to reset and reformat how we present ourselves, how we operate, what our strategy is. And we're discussing Indigenous engagement strategy at the University of Saskatchewan now. We've got a draft document. Vice Provost Jackie Ottman is engaged in ongoing consultation. So what do we do with all these strategies? My thing with strategy, so we could put a strategy out for your department to engage. At the end of the day, you choose. So strategic was a Greek term. I Googled this, was a Greek term for what the generals came up with in the tent before the battle. They did strategists. I don't know how to pronounce H in Greek, but it became strategy. Tactics were what the foot soldiers did on the day. So the strategy is take Troy, and the tactics were whatever enabled the guys on the day to take Troy. So we can put a strategy out there, and it can be 50 pages long and come with an online training module, and then you as the worker, as the fighter on the day, you've got to navigate how that works and how you achieve these strategic aims in a context where all the generals are back in the ivory tower. So it's no one's ever cracked this problem, but it doesn't mean we don't try. I just do think we need to be very careful about discipline-specific terms and approaches, because there's just not enough communication, and we don't have the time to sit there and explain everything from 101 to a community. It's a good question.
Simon, I'll ask my second question here, and that's about the north-south divide and the resource extraction industry, and how this is going to play out. And so one of the questions, as you're looking at the map that you put up, there's not very many cases up north. There's 135, I think you said, in Saskatchewan, right, where we have substantial amount of healthcare resources to address the problem. So what is going to happen when we have so many in Saskatchewan that we're not able to actually accommodate anybody being brought down from the north, for instance, and that our beds are full, our capacity is met, and we just simply have to turn people away, and people who are in a healthcare context where the resources don't exist in the same way. And so I know they're going to put up field hospitals up north. From what I gather is that they're planning to put field hospitals in, and whether or not they'll be able to accommodate patients in any way similar to what they can be accommodated in the south, not to mention people who are also going through things like cancer treatment and dialysis and other things like that. And so when I look at this, partly what you see again, and I've heard this narrative from from friends of mine who are non-Indigenous, middle class, upper class white people who are younger than I am a little bit, but around the same age, that, well, at some point in time, we got to get back to work. We just got to let it take its course. And it's going to fall where it falls, and people are going to die. And that's kind of just the way it is, because the outcome of what's going to happen in other aspects is much more devastating than if we try to control it the way we're controlling it, right? So people are going to be out of work, they're going to be doing all these other things, and so the health risk actually of continuing the way we're doing is actually going to be quite inflated if we do this for a long period of time, right? So I hear them saying that, and in my mind I'm thinking, okay, and who does that leave behind then, right? That leaves behind, and when you look at the complex health profiles of our people, and if you look at it through, what we look at through a syndemic approach is the interaction between COVID-19 and other health and social determinants, right? That this places our population at much, much greater risk than any other population, particularly our rural and remote people, but also our inner city people who are living in poverty, right? So poverty being understood in the context of a lot of the contexts in which I work, that poverty is a natural disaster, a socioeconomic disaster, right? And so, but in this is that north-south split of the basis of our economy in Saskatchewan, of course, is agriculture is one of the things. There's a history of making sure that First Nations and Métis people were not able to participate in that economy, even though they were highly, highly adept at being farmers, but particularly around the First Nations, all the restrictions and policies that were placed in them being able to sell their crops and their cattle. So there's a history there, but also of the extraction industry and the fact that it fuels the rest of the province in terms of our ability. So even our university, right? Like we get a huge amount of money that comes through taxpayer dollars, but also comes through donations and other things to the university. But to other places, right, including our hospitals, and we have Cameco, we have all these other, and so how over time do you see that playing out in terms of, again, First Nations and Métis people of this province of just saying, this is, and then we have Truth and Reconciliation, right? So how the heck in this context You know, and we had one of our chiefs get a hold of us this week and say, you know, why is it that we seem to be getting far less resources than what we should be getting, and far less control over how resources are allocated than what we should be, if we're talking about nation to nation and TRC calls to action, right? So that's a big question in my head, is what is the narrative going to be after this? Is it going to be that, you know, the South once again, and we can put this across Canada, right? Like the southern parts, I mean, Alberta's another good example, Ontario, Quebec, you know, where the South will in the long term win out, and our northern communities could be devastated by this, and so how is that going to, you know?
In a lot of ways, you know, I don't know, but if you was to pull back and get an overview of it, I would suspect that it's just going to be an ongoing resource grab. It almost will embolden that. So now the federal and provincial coffers are going to be empty. So you got to fill them up again. So it's just going to be a grab. It's just going to, and again, the pressure will be, well, you know, you don't want to be broke, do you? And so it would not be difficult to get electoral support for the recolonization of Indigenous peoples. You know, if you're outvoted, this is where the Constitution is going to be pulled out again. Like, who gets to decide all these things? Guaranteed down, like is what we're seeing in the Amazon, Brazilian Amazon. New president comes in and goes, they don't have any rights, go for it. You know, it just drives ongoing colonization. And I think we've got to be really careful and call it out for what it is that, well, you want to refill the coffers. Why do you already did it first time round from us. You know, we're actually going to have to be, and it's going to be hard, because Indigenous people will be blamed for ongoing economic recession if we don't sign up to rampant resource extraction. So Wet'suwet'en will be frontline still. They're frontline at the moment. They will remain there. And we're outnumbered, right? I mean, it doesn't matter what I say. It doesn't matter what we say. It's actually going to matter what non-Indigenous people say. So do we have enough allies, and are our allies brave enough to actually step up again and go, no, this is not right. This is against the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People of 2007, which Canada and New Zealand are signatories to. This is wrong. Because there will be a lot of people who go, well, don't care. And then there'll be other people who go, you're right, it's wrong, but what choice have we got? You know? So I think that it's just, I mean, here's a good thing. Our young people who have been frontline in climate change stuff and activism and the environment and all that, you know, for most of their lives, right? They're there, they got the energy, they're going to university, they're getting degrees, they're getting research degrees, they're articulate, they're able to synthesize different disciplines. This is getting back to Eric's question, that this problem, like climate change, like human rights, you have to synthesize different disciplines to be able to understand what's going on. Indigenous scholarship does that naturally, right? It's nothing for any of us to pull in some history. We're not going to push ourselves as historians, but you've got to know that history. We pull in some Western science on pandemics. I'm not an epidemiologist, but here's some papers. I can read them. I understand what's going on. So we do that naturally in all of our jobs and all of our research. And this, like I say, like first the earthquake, then the disaster, first the pandemic, then the disaster. We're going to be faced with a very dangerous situation. As our ancestors have before us. We don't shrink from it, and we try and fit our young people as best we can to take on these battles. And they are battles, and Wet'suwet'en and frontline, you know, it could get worse, and I just don't want to see allies now going, oh, well, yeah, before the pandemic, you know, now that I don't have my chocolate for Easter, I'm really kind of, you know, good luck. I mean, this is going to be a make or break for a lot of allyship, right? I really believe that. And, you know, sometimes it's best to be in the Indigenous camp than in the ally camp, because they can pick and choose. we can't do that so easily. But also with that, the North-South divide, when my parents were here a while ago, and I was saying, you know, they've got this sort of reliance on agriculture, and Alberta's got a reliance on fossil fuels and all that. I said, there's no plan B. And my father, bless him, he goes, oh, come on, there's got to be a plan B. I'm like, Dad, there's no plan B. Like, if there was a plan B, they would have rolled it out last year, right? So it's always amazing that a crisis, a disaster, it puts a government on what? Like, we are watching every decision, everything they say and do in a way that we wouldn't have. Who comes along next as a governance structure, and who do we want to lead us? Because if it doesn't change after this, you know, I might just retire and go and sit out on my island or something, because there's opportunity in this. Current systems have failed. So I'm not going to vote for people who want the same old, but who am I going to vote for? You know, who's up there? You know? I don't want to finish on a high note. I see Louise, you have unclicked your muted button. Does that mean you want to talk? Elder Half was one of the first people I met. I met Amiasu many years ago. She's one of the reasons I ended up here. It's your daughter's fault. Made it sound so nice and warm.
Hi, guys. It's so good to see everybody's faces and to hear these voices. This is actually very educational for me. I've been in contact with about maybe 40 people daily on email, and just trying to lift their spirits up. And I'm encouraging them to do be involved in all kinds of activities and do some self-contemplation, and to look after their wills, because we're all facing different stages of our lives, and we must pay attention to the spiritual aspects of what the land provides for us and for with each other. It is so. Those have been my thoughts. I'm not an academic, but I have life experience. So I really don't have anything to contribute, except for me, I don't like the word prayer, but because it doesn't speak to me that way, but that's what I do on a daily basis, and to be reflective and to nurture people on an emotional and spiritual level. So that's my journey. Thank you.
I just wanted to say, Louise, happy birthday.
Yes, Lou, it was your birthday the other day. Yes.
Yes, happy birthday.
Yeah.
I'll mute myself, I think.
Simon, I have a question both for you and I think also for Louise, if you wouldn't mind sharing. One of the things that I've been thinking about and sort of reflecting on as this whole process has gone through, and that you alluded to in the beginning of your talk, and that I know is a really important concept, is that of all my relations. And so my understanding of that is that all my relations is also related to the idea that everything in our world is animate, that everything has a spirit, that everything moves, and that it's my responsibility and obligation to establish a relationship with everything in my world, all my relations. So how does COVID-19 fit into that? Because I mean, I've been thinking about it, and I've been thinking, okay, it is animate, it must be a relation. How do I establish a relationship with it, and what does that look like? Practically, ethically, morally, traditionally, and modern. And so I would love to hear what you and Louise have to say about that.
You're muted, Louise. You go. You're muted. There we go. You're muted and unmuted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Oh, okay. Well, I can't hear your, I'm sorry, I really missed out on that question because I don't, you know, technology and me, we don't agree with each other a lot at the time. So can you get back to me on that question? Tara, I'll try to go back and listen again. Hang on a second. Don't know how to do this.
Ask the question again. I can.
Well, I mean, I heard the question and I'll answer it, and then so the question was, COVID-19 is COVID-19 a relation in some way. So when we talk of all my relations, and Tara pointed out when I was talking of Rua Moko being a relation, that it's a hazard, it causes earthquakes in there, but he ain't going anywhere. And you want to live in New Zealand, you're going to live with him. And I guess at the moment, if you want to live on planet Earth, you're going to live with COVID-19. My relationship with COVID-19 is through hot water and soap and alcohol that I rub on my hands. But I drink a little bit too. I've thought about this too. And wouldn't just be COVID-19. If it's all my relations, you know, we all have relations that we kind of look at sideways, that test us, that can bring the worst out in us, but also the best. One of the discourses you see after a disaster, and we will see it with this, is that people walking the streets, if you are the wrong color or you have gang colors or a mask or something, you're a looter. All right. So, you know, there's this idea that that people are dangerous, and that dangerous times make people more dangerous. Whereas actually people generally pull together. They generally pull together and they acknowledge those relationships in a way that before this, you know, maybe, you know, was anyone taking groceries to the old lady down the road 3 weeks ago? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, did you know who was in this? So it actually, I think, generally pulls people together in relationships. But specifically, you were asking about COVID-19 and how this thing fits into our lives. It moves, it's animate, it seems to have agency. It doesn't choose everybody. So I don't know. But now that Elder Louise half has heard my answer to your question, how are we related to this goddamn thing?
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me? Okay. You know, there's the sacred and the profane, and I don't know how we're related to it. My understanding is that it came from animals, and all of us have the sacred and profane. I mean, we have within our body stuff that can stop us in our track, such as cancer, an aneurysm, any of that. And maybe it's self-created. I frankly don't know. It's something that I would have to contemplate on and figure out what my relationship what my relationship it is with it. There is a word in Cree, and I can't think of it offhand because I'm being put on the spot. I have to think about these things, but Eutzenean is something like Eutzenean. And my grandmother used to say, don't kiss that animal Gutzenen or something like that. It'll possess you, or it'll be contagious or pass on to your system. So I had to be respectful to those animals. And one of the other things that I have recently learned from one of my elders, and it's that particular word, we are taught in in our community, in the Cree culture at least, that there are certain animals we never eat. They're just not on our menu, and we don't go out and kill coyotes, for example, or mice, or eagles, because they serve a different purpose. And maybe that is part of the I don't know whether it's the right word, dichotomy of the sacred and the profane. I don't know. I'm only surmising. I do a lot of contemplation. It's something that I would have to do an internal research and ask my elders as well.
Can I add our story that what our community thinks in back home Bangladesh, some of the indigenous people? Actually, we are all related, and relationship beings responsibility. And if you look at the current colonization or neoliberalism, we are not respecting our relationship with that we are related. We are disrespectful. That's why we are making profit on it, making business on it. That's why we are killing the animal that we shouldn't. We do not respect on the animal. So the COVID-19 we see as is coming for disrespect to our relationship, to disrespect our that we are not doing our accountability that we supposed to do. So how to recover it? Our according to our community, when my mom used to say, you have to take care of it. You have to build that relationship that you have broke it, and ask for apology that other people did it, but it's also your part because you have seen it. If you don't speak up, they will keep continuing doing it, and it will impact you. So we have to rebuild that relationship that we have broke for our greediness.
Thanks, Ranjan. I guess I should turn on my video. Are there any other questions that anybody wants to ask before we kind of wrap this up for today? We're already half an hour over, but it's been such a nice discussion. And I hope that we can kind of continue that as we continue to have these webinars and other opportunities to chat online. Are there any other questions?
I'll just say, I mean, one of the things that I would say in the context that we're in, and this is my own opinion and not the opinion of others, but I think that this really shows us the context we're in, why we need a Saskatchewan First Nations and Métis Health Authority. Whether that looks like the Health Authority in British Columbia or not, or whether it looks like something different, because even in terms of the data around the Métis and Métis not figuring in, my sense would be that may or may not be true, but we don't have any way, for instance, that we're tracking it. And so while we have the First Nations and Métis Health Services within the Health Authority, that branch of the Health Authority is relatively small, and I think one of the things that we should be asking our communities is around this interface between nations of people in Saskatchewan and funding and self-determination and sovereignty, so that under the umbrella potentially of a First Nations and Métis Health Authority, what we could end up with is being able to collect our own data, being able to track, being able to work with our communities to capture the picture and the narrative of what something like this looks like, but also in terms of other kinds of disasters, and that but that comes from that interface of First Nations and Métis, and I would say Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, and other First Nations knowledge, and Michif, and the knowledge of Métis people, but that interface with other forms of knowledge that are supportive. And that I don't believe that we can get that under the current configuration of the SHA, and that if we had something like a First Nations and Métis Health Authority that was driven by and run by Indigenous people, both with training in traditional ways and also training in other ways through universities and other means, that we would be much better positioned. And so that's the one last thing that I'll say, that, and that's just my opinion. It's not the opinion of our centers or my colleagues or anything like that. But as I look at this, I feel that that our ability to gather knowledge and to pull knowledge together and to synthesize knowledge and to figure out the phenomena that's happening in relation to what is embedded in First Nations and Métis languages is so incredibly important. And the only way, I think, or a better way of doing it than what we have now, is to have a health authority that is sovereign and under the control of our Indigenous peoples. So I'll just say that as a lasting thing.
So can I ask a question here?
Sure.
In continuing with what Caroline was saying and what we were referring to during this talk today, how do you see the role of the traditional healers to be more involved with the situation and in a collaborative way? How do you see the health system support them to contribute to the society and the other way around?
Oh, you asking me? Oh.
I would say both you and
Okay.
Luis, perhaps.
Yes, I mean, my 2 cents is that, and I would drop the word traditional healer and say healer. I think the word tradition can constrain us in our thinking. They're healers, and I'm very much influenced by Professor Mason Jury, who was the first Māori psychologist or psychiatrist. I still get the 2 confused. He was at school with my father. You know, they're old men now, but he once said, even though he worked in with community and had elders and all that, he was Western trained, and he was identifying the role for traditional approaches, but he also said sometimes you just need a pill. And so and healers don't ignore something that works. It can be, you know, we as Indigenous people can assimilate other technologies and other concepts. You know, we haven't put up barriers to evolving our knowledge. So a healer, an Indigenous healer, will use traditional approaches and frameworks and concepts and language and prayer and all these things, of course. And then maybe sometimes they go, geez, my auntie had that. What you need is you want to get down there and you want to get one of the blah, blah, blah pills. Like, you know, sometimes they have the voice that someone will listen to, but they may still be providing a non-traditional thing. So I see their role as fundamental, but they're fundamental as healers. And the tradition part, you know, words mean things. We have to be careful when we label things like that. So I would say, yep, Indigenous healers, they're going to have a role. They have a role. They always had. It's just my.
Oh, you're muted there.
I was just thanking for the correction of the Indigenous healer in a state of traditional healers. Very interesting referrals, because I was not sure how to put it in the word, and I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Maybe if I could ask everybody to join me in thanking Dr. Lambert. It's kind of awkward to do it, so we'll have like kind of a silent clap for you. Thank you so much.
No, thank you all, and thank you for organising it, Alison. You know, this may be the new way we do these things for quite some. Man, I can't wait. Imagine the first conference. Imagine the first Indigenous conference we all get to go to. I mean, wow. Mm-hmm. It's going to be. Mm-hmm. It's going to be a good time. So, but thank you all for listening. It's just a conversation. We keep it going.
Yeah, thanks so much. And then I'll also invite everybody. Next Friday, we have another webinar happening. Darcy Cullen from UBC Press, she's the acquisitions editor there, is going to be joining us for a talk at 11 a.m. Saskatchewan time or Central time on publishing as knowledge sharing in the digital age. And You can find the Zoom information on our website and Facebook, and the slides from today, and then eventually it'll take me probably a week or so to get the recording ready to go and up on our website as well, but you'll be able to access this after on our webpage too. So thanks so much.
And can I just say one thing about Raven Space that I encourage you to do before, and I really encourage you to come to that talk. So Raven Space is an Indigenous platform at UBC Press to bring together academic publication with community voice. And there's a free publication that's on their website if you go to UBC Press and look under Raven Space, of an elder from the West Coast. And why we're interested in it, our centers, is I've been working on a project with Bill Mussel, and who's a Stolo elder, and Bill's work that he's put together over the years, which is considerable. But I would love to see, like Louise, I would love to see you take a look at that platform, and potentially how we could take your work, your poetry and other types of work that you have done, and do a Raven Space piece. So with Raven Space, they use video and other kinds of media along with the written word. And I've talked to Maria Campbell of potentially maybe doing something with her work. So I think it's a platform that she'll teach us about, but I really encourage people to let other people know, because I think that interface between university and community, that this is a really interesting space. And I can see that Indigenous peoples, we could use it in all kinds of ways. And it's not so hard to use, apparently. So yeah, I'm very excited about the potential projects that we have on the go. But like Louise, I could see your poetry, and like I could see us doing a piece with Raven Space with your work would be amazing. Yeah. Anyway, I'll just give that plug for that talk.
Cool. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll see you another time. Okay. Bye.